I decided to write this talk because I sort of started in this space as a privacy advocate in 2015-16. And you know, a lot of the last 5-6 years, I think especially, we've seen a shift from interest in privacy to other types of movements, especially from the cypherpunk movement to even what Gitcoin I think has often promoted as sort of the solarpunk movement. And I've kind of reconverted back to being very focused on cypherpunk philosophy. And one of the fundamental reasons for this, let's see if this changes, is a paper by Philip Rogaway, which is called The Moral Character of Cryptographic Work, which is the title of the talk, from 2015, where he essentially makes the case for cryptography as a political tool. And I think all technology is political. Artifacts have politics. This is also a famous paper from the 1980s. But fundamentally, in particular, cryptography rearranges power. It determines who can basically move information and to whom. And that inherently in the internet age is extremely powerful. And in the context of the internet, and now Ethereum and others, it's even more powerful because it pretty much controls the entire way that value and incentives flow in society. So, we should be thinking in the context of this about the history of how cryptography is being used or has been used, and think of it as a resistance tool or think of it as a political tool. And this is not really a new concept. Like the Citadel and these sorts of tools were used in the sort of Ionian era. This is like thousands of years ago. They've been used in the Abbasid revolution and other revolutions in historical times. So in this case, they were using a lot of secret communication and cryptanalysis in the context of basically like warfare between the Mawali, which were like a kind of more, I guess, rebel alliance, and the sort of Umayyad Caliphate in that context. It's being used in actually protecting information from those who might seek to either destroy it for political or sometimes even religious reasons. So in the alchemical renaissance, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, you had a lot of Gnosticism, you had a lot of sort of more magical, alchemical work happening in the shadows, even under the court of Queen Elizabeth, in this case under what was called the Bohemian Court. For those of you familiar, actually, what's funny is this is the sort of moving castle of the Bohemian Court, which is where the Howell's Moving Castle came from. Just a fun reference. But like, this sort of, to me, reflects in the same way as in the context of Galileo, which is going to be the next one, the fact that we're fundamentally very beholden to, and I think we should really be thankful for cryptography in bringing us a lot of other things that maybe we don't actually expect that it's brought us over the last 2,000, 3,000 years. And so in the context of these examples, I think we have to be sort of really going back to the cypherpunk roots and the systems that we're building today, which is why I feel like I'm kind of resurging back to those roots myself. And the sort of fundamental starting point for the modern movement, which I think everyone here is sort of familiar with, is the Cyphernomicon or Timothy May's work alongside Eric Hughes with the Cypherpunk Manifesto. And fundamentally, I think this work, as time goes on, will continue to be underexplored because we forget history very easily. And so if cryptography is a tool that rearranges power, then cryptography is a tool for the people, and it's a means of reclaiming our digital autonomy and our rights to privacy and our freedom of expression. And in that context, I think we should be very careful about the tools that we're building and look back to some of the work that started this whole thing in the first place, and that the work that Satoshi did was in the lineage of, and think about the sort of not just peer-to-peer forms of electronic cash that we're building, but also the specifics to how those tools, how those technologies rearrange power. So if we actually, I think, spend more time on this, and if there's more conferences like this, and if there's more people like you, I think we can do a lot better in terms of promoting those values. And that's why I'm glad that we have things like Dark Fi, for example, in the context of the current sort of movement. So I think this is just kind of a PSA, right? But there's some actual things I want to mention after this as well. Because we do seem to be losing this battle on multiple fronts. And one of the ways we're losing this is by on-chain actions and on-chain tools becoming largely focused on trying to capture information or to learn or essentially abuse the fact that there is this transparent ledger in order to essentially give power to larger centralized institutions. And it's very possible that we just continue in this direction for the next 20, 50 years and that we actually end up in a worse scenario than we started because everything is on-chain. And so I think my kind of example here is a little bit outdated now, but I particularly like this one because Arkham is really just blatantly promoting itself as sort of on-chain intelligence. It's like the CIA of blockchains in this case or something. And I think that the biggest problem with this is fundamentally that once you start allowing these kinds of tools to be the norm, it's very hard to undo that. Norms are very kind of slow to evolve. It takes a long time for them to ingrain themselves in a political or social context. And if we sort of are complacent or forget that that's the case or pay less attention to what's happening in the broader ecosystem or stay cloistered in our own sort of spaces, we're going to see stuff like this emerge when it's too late versus when we can actually do something about it. And so I think, the question is, where did a lot of, maybe not this room because you're here, but where did the cypherpunks go, right? Where are the people that sort of started a lot of these movements? And I was actually just talking with Kurt, who's in the audience, I think, too, and was at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and is now doing a lot of great work in the space as well in Web3, about the fact that even when John Perry Barlow wrote the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, he really thought that the web or the Rebel Alliance had won. He was very convinced that, we've already made this internet, it's great, good job everyone, like, let's go home. I think that is fundamentally the mistake that we're making in some ways now. And I think, the interesting example of this, I just think semantically even, is the way in which Web3 as a term has evolved. So Web3 was actually originally what was used before this current iteration of Web3, in fairness, but it was originally used by Gavin Wood to describe a post-Snowden web. And a post-Snowden web is one where systems for decentralized encrypted information and publication like Freenet or BitTorrent are possible, one in which dynamic transient information for private broadcast or private or broadcast communications both is possible, and where you have this sort of consensus-driven, trustless transaction infrastructure and sort of open systems. With things like Solana, we're even sort of losing the last one, where a lot of stuff is actually closed source. It's not even open source necessarily at this point. And so fundamentally, I think where the cypherpunks went is a very important question, and we should try to find them here and elsewhere in our sort of lives. And I think if we do that, we can sort of prevent this excessive acceleration of the space. And I think there's sort of a particular piece that is relevant to this, which is related to subcultural evolution and normative development. And specifically, this is a little bit of a hyperbolic example, but David Chapman's piece, Geeks, Mops, and Sociopaths, kind of describes the fact that subcultures become very popular. Someone creates a thing. People say, this is a cool thing. I'd like to go and spend time with this cool thing. That attracts more people who are interested in sort of understanding this network. And over time, people see, hey, there might be money to be made in this thing, and that money gets extracted from the system elsewhere and becomes part of a totally distinct new system. And so, one of the things, why we need the cypherpunks and why we need to pay attention to these other things is because we are using capital systems, we're using value systems, and fundamentally if we're using value systems, we have to contend with the fact that we need to know where that value is going. And so, even though just before this we were sort of talking about like the introduction was saying that venture is maybe not good or venture is dangerous. I actually don't think venture is necessarily bad or certain types of investment are bad. But we do need to know where that investment is going, and we need to know where capital is flowing, and we need to sort of make sure that it's staying within the circles or within the ecosystems that prevent this sort of hyper growth and in turn sort of internal collapse of the space that we're in. So this is the actually most common way I think that subcultures or movements fail, is through the sort of acceleration in capital formation and in general sort of like restructuring of power, which is why we should think back to that first slide and the fact that there's some tools we could use to potentially fight back against that same force. The other way in which movements often fail is in sort of stagnation or subcultural stagnation. And this is actually perhaps an unfair example that I'm using for this one, but I think there was a movement called the D-Web movement, which I think is still relevant in some ways today. But the decentralized web movement was very, mainly like the open source movement was, like against capital. It really tried to be very purist. It did not let really people form businesses or form structures of collective sort of growth. And in turn, this ended up with essentially a few things happening. One, it became too inward looking and it lacked the incentives to gain traction. People burned out. Maintainers of open source software historically, maybe the best one being OpenSSL, most famous, burned out, Heartbleed happened, and ultimately a lot of those projects ended up becoming less trustworthy because people were suspicious that maybe if they rely on this tool, it's just going to collapse inwardly as well. And most importantly, I think, these kinds of movements can be sort of red queened out of existence. And what I mean by this is a Lewis Carroll reference. And basically, the Red Queen is a character in the story that basically says, essentially, it's interesting that you are, running as fast as you can and just staying in place. You actually have to double your speed every week or every day in order to get anywhere. And so it's just it was sort of it's much better in the book, I'll say. But basically, the point is that you have to keep accelerating in some capacity in order to even keep pace with the rest of the world or the rest of the movements that are happening, because they're powered by much larger forces and much larger forces of capital. And I think this is one of the biggest problems that occurs in very ideological communities where we see people who are genuinely passionate about a cause, but maybe don't necessarily have a clear strategy as to how to promote the mission or promote the vision. And so the view in my last couple of years, I guess, in the space, mostly working, in part still with DAOs like Gitcoin, ENS, zkSync, and so forth, but also independently, is that we need to really define the values and principles that bring groups together and promote them optimistically in the context of a lot of the work that we're doing here. I think that like a lot of the speakers that have already gone have done a great job of this with clear projects that are actually making a difference. I think setting norms and rituals like this conference, or just setting norms and rituals with each other, even in private, even philosophical reading groups and so forth, I think are really important to preserve core values. To do that sort of, I'll say this is a little bit wordy, but like polycentrically, where we build this together is really important, but still with different nodes across the world. And perhaps most importantly and most missing is forward planning for the natural death and rebirth of certain types of smaller communities within a movement. If you really rely on and this is why the polycentricity is so important, if you really just rely on one node, just like in many of the systems we're using, it turns out it's very easy to take down. And so fundamentally, we want to be really planning out where is the next node, where is the next space, who are the people that are going to drive that, and how can we sort of work together on these different parts of these movements. If we don't do this, or if we're not careful about how we do this, this is a classic example that I think most people have seen, the sort of general interference with organizations, sort of procedures for the CIA. Great example of how easy it is to kind of destroy organizational movements. And essentially, it's everything that, spoiler alert, a lot of DAOs do today, where people kind of bike shed ideas. You stop focusing on the real things, the real problems, and you start sort of like infighting a lot versus really trying to build unity together around a specific common goal. And you know, I can't tell whether, you know, how successful this playbook has been in the history of the CIA. I don't know. It's like not really available information, but I suspect that at least based on a lot of the work that's happening in the space and how easily sort of different movements sort of can fragment, that this is a real issue, and hopefully those principles from before can help with resolving that. We need to resist the urge to infight or fragment. We need to make sure that we have norms that bring people together rather than create conflict, which I think this group is really great at. We should ensure that there are a wide range of funding sources, including for-profit funding sources, but also grants and other sorts of ecosystem support, ideally that are between peers, even between us in this room. And we should, you know, plan for, where did this go? We should plan for essentially, like a sort of a brighter future around our privacy ecosystems. I think I missed one slide in my putting this together, but I think you guys get the point, right? This is like the general sort of like thesis for, I think, creating any movement. And I think for me, as I guess like someone that really values this community, cares about the fact that this community has been true to those values for such a long period of time, and has a sort of, I think, a really good soul and a really good heart. I hope that this group can kind of continue to make progress and help build a better privacy ecosystem and help rearrange power. And I hope that I can be part of that movement as well. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And thank you all for being here.